Richard Wolff sat in his office, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin on his face. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the computer screen in front of him and the small desk lamp that cast a yellowish glow over scattered papers. On the screen was a video clip of Donald Trump speaking at one of his rallies. Richard had watched it several times already, pausing occasionally to jot down notes or chuckle at something he found particularly amusing. Richard was a man who thrived on controversy. For years, he had made a name for himself as a political commentator known for his sharp tongue and unrelenting criticism of public figures. His shows often drew large audiences, mostly liberals who enjoyed hearing him tear apart politicians they disliked. And tonight, Richard had decided, Donald Trump would be his target. He leaned forward, tapping his pen against the edge of the desk as he thought about how to frame his critique. It wasn't enough to simply call Trump out for his policies or leadership style. Richard wanted to make this personal. He wanted to dig deep into what he saw as the absurdity of Trump's persona, to expose the flaws in a way that would leave his audience laughing and nodding along. As he scribbled down ideas, Lisa Carter, his producer, walked into the room. She was carrying a cup of coffee and looked like she hadn't slept much. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun and her glasses were slightly crooked. "You ready for tonight?" she asked, setting the coffee down on his desk. "Of course," Richard replied without looking up. "This is going to be fun." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Fun? You sure you're not laying it on too thick this time? People are already fired up about Trump. If you go too hard, you might lose some viewers." Richard waved her off. "Relax, Lisa. That's why they tune in, to hear me say what everyone else is thinking but too polite to say out loud." He tapped his notes confidently. "Trust me, I know exactly what I'm doing." Lisa sighed but didn't argue further. She knew better than to try changing Richard's mind once he'd set his sights on something. Instead, she gave him a quick rundown of the schedule before leaving him alone to finish preparing. Later that evening, Richard took his place behind the desk in the studio. The bright lights made him squint slightly, but he adjusted quickly, smoothing out his tie and flashing a practiced smile at the camera. The show's intro music played, and soon the red light above the lens blinked on, signaling that they were live. "Good evening, everyone," Richard began, his voice smooth and confident. "Tonight, we're going to talk about someone who never fails to entertain us, Donald Trump." The audience erupted into applause, cheering loudly as Richard paused dramatically. When the noise died down, he continued, "Love him or hate him, there's no denying that Trump knows how to keep things interesting. Whether it's his tweets, his speeches, or his unique approach to diplomacy, the man always gives us plenty to discuss." The crowd laughed and Richard joined in, shaking his head as if marveling at the absurdity of it all. "But let's be honest here," he said, leaning closer to the camera. "For all the headlines and sound bites, when you strip away the spectacle, what are we really left with? A billionaire reality TV star turned politician whose main qualification seems to be an ability to dominate the news cycle." More laughter followed, though there were a few boos mixed in from those watching at home who supported Trump. Richard ignored them, pressing on with his usual flair. "Take his foreign policy, for example. Remember when he claimed North Korea was no longer a nuclear threat after meeting Kim Jong-un? Or how about his insistence that Russia is our friend despite all evidence to the contrary? It's almost like he thinks diplomacy is just another episode of The Apprentice." The audience roared with approval, clapping enthusiastically as Richard delivered each punchline. He was in his element now, pacing back and forth across the stage as he launched into a series of jokes about Trump's rhetoric, his business dealings, and even his hairstyle. By the time the segment ended, Richard felt invigorated, basking in the knowledge that he had once again given his fans exactly what they wanted. Across town, Karoline Leavitt was sitting on her couch, scrolling through social media while half watching the same broadcast. At 28, Karoline was relatively new to the world of journalism, but she had quickly gained attention for her insightful articles and fiery debates. Unlike Richard, whose career spanned decades, Karoline was still building her reputation. But she had something Richard lacked: genuine passion. When Richard's segment came on, Karoline felt her blood boil. She couldn't believe how dismissive he was being, not just of Trump, but of anyone who supported him. To her, it felt less like commentary and more like bullying. Sure, she didn't agree with everything Trump said or did, but she respected the fact that millions of Americans believed in him. And Richard's mockery struck her as lazy and unfair. Grabbing her laptop, Karoline opened a blank document and started typing furiously. Within minutes, she had drafted a response titled, "Richard, Wolff's Hypocrisy Exposed." In it, she called out his selective use of facts, pointing out instances where he had praised other politicians for similar behavior he now condemned in Trump. She also highlighted how his reliance on ridicule undermined meaningful dialogue, alienating people rather than persuading them. By the time she hit publish, it was late, and Karoline was exhausted. Still, she couldn't resist refreshing the page every few minutes to see if anyone had commented. To her surprise, the article began gaining traction almost immediately. Readers shared it on Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook, praising Karoline for holding Richard accountable. Some even tagged him directly, challenging him to respond. Karoline smiled to herself as she closed her laptop. She knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Richard Wolff might think he had the upper hand, but Karoline was determined to prove him wrong. Little did either of them know, their paths were about to cross in ways neither could have anticipated. And so, as Richard basked in the glow of another successful broadcast, and Karoline prepared for the battle ahead, the stage was set for a clash that would test both their principles and their resolve. What started as a simple critique would soon spiral into something far bigger, a confrontation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The night of the debate arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The event was being held in a large auditorium that buzzed with excitement. Rows of seats filled quickly as people from all walks of life gathered to witness what promised to be a clash of titans. Supporters of both Richard Wolff and Karoline Leavitt wore their allegiances proudly, some holding signs, others wearing t-shirts or buttons bearing slogans supporting their preferred debater. Cameras flashed as reporters lined up near the entrance, eager to capture every moment. Inside, the stage was set with two podiums facing each other, separated by a small table holding water bottles and microphones. A large screen behind them displayed the title of the debate, Politics, Persuasion, and Principles, a conversation on modern discourse. The moderator, a seasoned journalist named Peter Dawson, stood off to the side reviewing his notes one last time before stepping into the spotlight. Backstage, Richard and Karoline were preparing in separate rooms. Richard paced nervously, muttering under his breath as he went over his opening statement for the 100th time. He had rehearsed relentlessly, yet doubt lingered in the back of his mind. This wasn't just another talk show appearance. This was live, unscripted, and unpredictable. For someone who thrived on control, it felt unsettling. Karoline, on the other hand, sat quietly in her chair, sipping herbal tea to calm her nerves. She flipped through her notes methodically, ensuring everything she wanted to say was clear in her mind. Unlike Richard, she wasn't focused on winning or losing. Her goal was simple: to engage in an honest conversation and demonstrate the value of respectful disagreement. Still, she couldn't deny feeling a flutter of anxiety. Facing Richard Wolff, a man known for tearing opponents apart, was no small feat. Finally, the lights dimmed and the crowd erupted into applause as Peter Dawson walked onto the stage. He greeted the audience warmly before introducing the participants. "Tonight," he began, "we have two voices representing very different perspectives. First, we have Richard Wolff, a veteran commentator whose sharp insights have shaped conversations around politics for decades. And opposing him is Karoline Leavitt, a rising journalist whose recent work has sparked widespread discussion about fairness and integrity in public discourse." As their names were called, Richard and Karoline took their places at the podiums. Richard gave the audience a confident smile, while Karoline nodded politely, her expression calm but resolute. The red light above the cameras blinked on, signaling the start of the broadcast. Peter opened the debate with a broad question. "Both of you have strong opinions about how political discussions should be conducted. Can you tell us briefly why you believe your approach is effective?" Richard leaned forward, gripping the sides of his podium. "Thank you, Peter," he said smoothly. "Look, when it comes to politics, people need to hear the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Humor and satire are powerful tools because they cut through the noise and make complex issues accessible. Sure, some people might not like my style, but at least I'm getting them to think." The audience chuckled appreciatively, and Richard basked in the reaction. But when Peter turned to Karoline, she didn't flinch. "I agree that humor can be effective," she replied, her voice steady. "But there's a difference between using humor to clarify and using it to ridicule. When we mock someone instead of engaging with their ideas, we shut down meaningful dialogue. That doesn't help anyone." Her words landed with surprising weight, drawing murmurs of agreement from parts of the audience. Richard shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this wouldn't be as easy as he'd hoped. The debate continued, with Peter guiding the conversation, through topics ranging from policy disagreements to the role of media in shaping public opinion. Richard relied heavily on his trademark sarcasm, peppering his responses with clever quips designed to undermine Karoline's arguments. At one point he smirked and said, "You talk a lot about respect, Karoline, but isn't it possible you're just too polite to call things out for what they really are?" Karoline didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she responded calmly, "Respect doesn't mean avoiding hard truths. It means presenting them in a way that encourages understanding rather than defensiveness. If we truly want progress, we need to listen to each other even when we disagree." The audience seemed divided. Some clapped enthusiastically for Richard's biting remarks, while others nodded along with Karoline's measured tone. It was clear that neither side was willing to concede ground easily. Things escalated when Peter asked Richard directly about inconsistencies in his past statements, issues Karoline had highlighted in her article. Richard stammered slightly, caught off guard. Context matters," he said, fumbling for words. "These things are complicated, and sometimes oversimplification does more harm than good." Karoline seized the opportunity. "Exactly," she said, her voice firm. "That's why it's important to avoid cherry-picking facts or twisting narratives to fit a particular agenda. Honesty and transparency build trust, and without trust we can't move forward as a society." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Even Richard looked momentarily shaken, though he quickly masked it with a forced laugh. "Very poetic, Karoline," he said, trying to regain control. "But let's not forget that politics isn't poetry. It's messy, and sometimes you have to fight fire with fire." Karoline shook her head. "Fighting fire with fire only burns everyone. What we need is leadership that inspires cooperation, not division. And that starts with how we treat each other in these conversations." By now, the audience was fully engaged, leaning forward in their seats as the tension mounted. Richard's usual charm seemed less effective against Karoline's unwavering composure. Every time he tried to undercut her with humor, she countered with logic and empathy, leaving him struggling to find his footing. As the debate neared its conclusion, Peter posed a final question. "If you could leave the audience with one message tonight, what would it be?" Richard hesitated, clearly thrown by the unexpected difficulty of the evening. When he finally spoke, his tone lacked its earlier bravado. "I guess I'd say, don't take yourself too seriously. Politics is serious business, sure, but that doesn't mean we can't have fun with it." When it was Karoline's turn, she took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. "My message is this. We don't have to agree on everything to treat each other with dignity and respect. Real change happens when we listen, not just to respond, but to understand. Let's focus on building bridges, not walls." The audience erupted into applause, many standing to show their appreciation. Richard forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. For the first time in his career, he felt genuinely defeated, not because he had lost the argument, but because he realized how much he had underestimated his opponent. After the debate ended, Richard retreated backstage, his mind racing. He had expected to dominate the conversation, to walk away victorious. Instead, he found himself questioning whether his methods had grown stale or overly harsh. As he packed up his notes, Lisa approached him cautiously. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Honestly, no. I thought I had this in the bag, but she was better prepared than I expected." Lisa nodded sympathetically. "She's smart, you can't deny that. Maybe this is a chance to rethink some things." Meanwhile, Karoline emerged from her dressing room to find a group of supporters waiting to congratulate her. They praised her performance, thanking her for standing up to Richard and reminding everyone of the importance of respectful discourse. Despite the praise, Karoline remained humble, shaking hands and thanking them for showing up. Later that night, as she lay in bed replaying the events in her mind, Karoline felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because she had bested Richard, but because she had sparked a conversation. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was hopeful that moments like this could inspire change, however small. For Richard, the night brought sleepless hours spent staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the debate, but within himself. Perhaps it was time to reconsider not just his tactics, but the values behind them. Neither of them realized it yet, but the debate marked the beginning of a transformation, one that would challenge their beliefs, reshape their careers, and ultimately remind them of the power of humility and growth. The days following the debate were unlike anything Richard Wolff had ever experienced. For years, he had been a dominant figure in political commentary, known for his sharp wit and unapologetic critiques. But now, for the first time, he found himself on the defensive. Social media was ablaze with reactions to the debate, and while some of his supporters still rallied behind him, many others were openly critical. Memes mocking his performance flooded Twitter, and YouTube compilations titled "Moments Richard" got owned racked up millions of views. Richard tried to ignore the noise at first, retreating into his apartment and avoiding the internet altogether. But it wasn't just online where he felt the sting of defeat. Friends and colleagues began approaching him cautiously, offering advice or simply asking how he was holding up. His producer, Lisa Carter, brought him coffee one morning and said gently, "You know, this happens to everyone sooner or later. It's not the end of the world." "It feels like it," Richard muttered, staring blankly at his laptop screen. He hadn't written anything since the debate, unable to summon the energy to craft another biting monologue. The thought of sitting behind his desk and delivering jokes about politicians felt hollow now, as if the words would ring false. What bothered him most wasn't the criticism itself, it was the realization that Karoline Leavitt had exposed something deeper. Her arguments had struck a nerve, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own approach. Was he really helping people think critically, or was he just using ridicule as a shield? Had he become so focused on tearing others down that he'd forgotten how to build anything meaningful? Meanwhile, Karoline's life had taken a dramatic turn for the better. In the wake of the debate, she became a sought-after voice in the media landscape. Invitations poured in from talk shows, podcasts, and conferences eager to hear her perspective. She appeared on morning news programs, discussing the importance of respectful dialogue, and wrote opinion pieces that further elaborated on her views. Her calm demeanor and thoughtful insights resonated with audiences across the political spectrum. But fame came with its own challenges. As her profile grew, so did the scrutiny. Critics accused her of being too idealistic, arguing that civility couldn't solve deep-seated issues like inequality or corruption. Others dismissed her as naive, claiming she didn't understand the harsh realities of politics. Still, Karoline remained steadfast in her beliefs. She knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but she also believed that progress started with small steps, like treating opponents with dignity instead of disdain. One afternoon, while preparing for an interview, Karoline received an email notification on her phone. It was from Richard Wolff. Intrigued, she opened it and read, "Dear Karoline, I've spent the past few days reflecting on our debate, and I have to admit, you made me think. Your points about respect and integrity stuck with me, and I realize, now that maybe I've relied too much on sarcasm over substance. This isn't easy for me to say, but I respect what you're trying to do, and I hope we can keep this conversation going. Best regards, Richard. Karoline stared at the message, unsure how to feel. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as a PR move, a way for Richard to save face after his loss. But another part of her recognized the courage it must have taken for him to reach out. After some thought, she replied, "Dear Richard, thank you for your honesty. I appreciate your willingness to reflect, and I agree that these conversations are important. Civility doesn't mean we have to agree. It means we owe it to each other to listen. Let's continue this dialogue, whether publicly or privately. Sincerely, Karoline." There. Exchange marked the beginning of an unlikely connection. Over the next few weeks, Richard and Karoline exchanged emails, sharing articles, books, and personal reflections. They didn't always see eye to eye, but their discussions were respectful and productive. For Richard, it was a chance to step back from the persona he'd built over decades and rediscover why he had entered journalism in the first place. For Karoline, it was validation that even those with opposing views could find common ground when they approached each other with openness and humility. As word of their correspondence spread, public interest grew. Some praised them for modeling constructive disagreement, while others accused them of going soft. Regardless of the backlash, both decided to address the situation head-on. Together, they agreed to co-author an op-ed piece, which they titled Beyond the Headlines, Finding Common Ground in Divided Times. In the article, they acknowledged their differences but emphasized the importance of bridging divides. "We live in a world where shouting matches often replace real conversations," they wrote. "But shouting doesn't solve problems, it creates more of them. By listening to each other, even when it's difficult, we can begin to heal the fractures in our society." The piece was published in a major newspaper and quickly went viral. Readers responded with heartfelt messages, thanking Richard and Karoline for reminding them of the value of empathy. Teachers shared the article with their students, using it as a lesson on civil discourse. Even politicians referenced it during interviews, calling for unity in an increasingly polarized climate. For Richard, the experience was transformative. He returned to his show with a renewed sense of purpose, toning down the sarcasm and focusing more on substantive analysis. While he still critiqued policies and leaders, he did so with greater nuance and less venom. His audience noticed the shift, and though some missed his old style, many welcomed the change. Karoline, too, continued to rise in prominence, becoming a leading advocate for respectful dialogue. She launched a podcast called Bridging the Divide. That's where she interviewed guests from all walks of life, politicians, activists, artists, and everyday citizens, about how they navigated disagreements. The show became a platform for exploring complex issues without resorting to hostility, earning praise from listeners around the globe. Despite their newfound success, neither Richard nor Karoline forgot the lessons they had learned. They understood that growth required vulnerability, and that true leadership meant admitting when you were wrong. Their journey from adversaries to collaborators served as proof that even the deepest divides could be bridged with patience and understanding. One evening, months after the debate, Richard invited Karoline to join him for dinner. They met at a quiet restaurant far from the cameras and microphones that usually followed them. Over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, they talked about everything: their families, their dreams, their fears. For the first time, they weren't commentator and journalist. They were simply two people navigating the complexities of life. As dessert arrived, Richard raised his glass. "To second chances," he said with a smile. Karoline clinked her glass against his. "And to honest conversations." They laughed, knowing that their story was far from over. What had started as a clash of egos had evolved into something far greater, a testament to the power of reflection, humility, and the human capacity for change. Months had passed since the debate, and Richard Wolff's life had changed in ways he never imagined. The once confident commentator who thrived on ridicule now found himself questioning not just his methods but also the values that had guided his career. He wasn't the same man who walked into that auditorium months ago armed with jokes and sarcasm. Instead, he was quieter, more reflective, and determined to make amends, not just for his mistakes, but for the broader impact of his words. Richard spent much of his free time reading books and articles about empathy, communication, and political philosophy. He devoured works by authors he'd previously dismissed as too idealistic or naive. Slowly, he began to see the world through a different lens, one where disagreement didn't have to mean hostility, and where understanding someone else's perspective could be more powerful than tearing them down. On air, Richard's tone shifted noticeably. His monologues became less about mockery and more about analysis. He still critiqued policies and politicians, but he did so with care, taking the time to explain why he disagreed rather than simply mocking their views. His audience noticed the change, and while some longtime fans missed his biting humor, many appreciated the depth and sincerity he brought to his work. Ratings dipped slightly at first, but they soon stabilized as new viewers tuned in, curious about this new Richard Wolff. Karoline Leavitt, meanwhile, continued to rise in prominence. Her podcast, Bridging the Divide, gained millions of downloads, and she became a regular guest on major news networks. But despite her growing fame, she remained grounded. She knew how easy it was to lose sight of your principles when success came knocking, so she made a conscious effort to stay true to herself. Every episode of her show, every article she wrote, and every speech she gave reinforced her belief in respectful dialogue, even when it felt like shouting would be easier. One day, Richard received an invitation to speak at a conference on media ethics. It was being organized by Karoline, who wanted to bring together journalists, commentators, and academics to discuss how the industry could foster healthier conversations. Richard hesitated at first. He wasn't sure he deserved a seat at the table, but eventually agreed after Karoline encouraged him. The conference took place in a grand hall filled with hundreds of attendees. Journalists from across the country mingled with professors, activists, and students, all eager to hear insights from leaders in the field. When it was Richard's turn to take the stage, he felt nervous, but resolved. Standing behind the podium, he looked out at the sea of faces and began to speak. "When I started my career," he said, his voice steady, "I thought my job was to entertain people, to make them laugh or shake their heads in disbelief, and for a long time that worked. But over the years I realized something important. Entertainment isn't enough. If we want to create real change, we need to do more than just point fingers or make fun of others. We need to engage, with respect, with curiosity, and with humility." The room erupted into applause, and Richard smiled faintly, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt proud of what he was saying, not because it was clever or provocative, but because it was honest. Later that evening, during a panel discussion featuring Richard, Karoline, and several other speakers, the conversation turned to the role of civility in public discourse. One audience member stood up and asked, "How can we expect people to be civil when emotions run so high? Isn't civility just another way of silencing those who are angry or upset?" Karoline leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Civility doesn't mean ignoring anger or pretending everything is fine," she replied. "It means acknowledging those feelings while still treating others with dignity. You can disagree passionately without resorting to insults or attacks. In fact, doing so often leads to better outcomes because people are more likely to listen when they feel respected." Richard nodded in agreement. "Exactly," he added. "We don't have to compromise our beliefs to treat each other decently. Respect isn't weakness, it's strength. It takes courage to listen, to admit when you're wrong, and to keep engaging even when it's hard." The panel ended with a standing ovation, and afterward Richard and Karoline stood outside the venue chatting with attendees. Many approached them to express gratitude, sharing stories of how their work had inspired them to seek common ground in their own lives. A young college student told Richard that his recent shows had helped her understand perspectives she'd previously dismissed. An older woman thanked Karoline for reminding her of the importance of patience and empathy in difficult conversations. As the crowd thinned out, Richard turned to Karoline. "You know," he said, "when this whole thing started, I thought you were just another critic trying to knock me down. But now, I think you might have saved me." Karoline laughed softly. "I didn't save you, Richard. You did that yourself. All I did was give you a push." They shared a smile, both knowing how far they'd come since that tense night in the auditorium. Their journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, frustration, and fear, but it had been worth it. Together they had shown that growth was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. In the weeks that followed, Richard and Karoline collaborated on a series of initiatives aimed at promoting respectful dialogue. They co-hosted town halls, where community members could discuss contentious issues without fear of judgment or hostility. They partnered with schools to teach students about the value of listening and empathy. And they launched a website featuring resources for anyone looking to improve their communication skills. Though their paths diverged professionally, Richard returned to his show, and Karoline focused on expanding her podcast. They remained close friends. They checked in regularly, offering advice and encouragement whenever the other faced challenges. Their bond had become a source of strength, a reminder that even the deepest divides could be bridged with effort and understanding. Years later, when asked about the debate that had sparked their unlikely friendship, both Richard and Karoline emphasized the same message. Change begins with humility. "None of us has all the answers," Richard once said in an interview. "But if we're willing to listen, to truly listen, we might just find solutions we never imagined." Karoline echoed his sentiment in a separate appearance. "Respect doesn't mean agreeing with everyone. It means valuing their humanity even when you disagree. That's how we build trust, and trust is the foundation of progress." Their story became a symbol of hope in a divided world. People pointed to Richard and Karoline as proof that enemies could become allies, that adversaries could learn from each other, and that redemption was always within reach. Their journey reminded everyone who heard it that no matter how entrenched our differences may seem, there is always room for growth, forgiveness, and connection. And so, Richard Wolff and Karoline Leavitt moved forward, not as perfect individuals but as imperfect people striving to do better. They knew they wouldn't get everything right, but they also knew that trying mattered more than anything else. In the end, it wasn't their victories or defeats that defined them. It was their willingness to keep learning, keep listening, and keep reaching across the divide. The morning after Richard Wolff's broadcast, Karoline Leavitt woke up to a flurry of notifications on her phone. Her article, "Richard Wolff's Hypocrisy Exposed," had gone viral overnight. Social media platforms were buzzing with reactions, some praising her sharp critique, others defending Richard, and a few calling for a direct confrontation between the two. Karoline scrolled through the comments, feeling a mix of pride and nervousness. She hadn't expected such a strong response so quickly. Her apartment was quiet except for the hum of her coffee maker. She poured herself a cup and sat down at her small kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen. The success of her article gave her confidence, but it also weighed heavily on her mind. She knew that writing a piece was one thing, but challenging someone like Richard Wolff, a seasoned commentator with years of experience, was another. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was her moment to step up. Karoline opened a new document and began drafting an open letter to Richard. In it, she challenged him to a live debate. "If you truly believe in your arguments," she wrote, "then let's have a real conversation about them. No sound bites, no jokes, just honest dialogue." She made sure to keep her tone respectful but firm, emphasizing that she wasn't afraid to hold her ground. Once she finished, she posted the letter online and sent copies to several news outlets, knowing full well that Richard would see it sooner or later. Meanwhile, Richard was having a very different kind of morning. He had woken up to dozens of messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers, all pointing him toward Karoline's article. At first, he dismissed it as just another angry rant from someone who disagreed with him. But as he skimmed through the piece, his expression darkened. Karoline had done her homework. She cited specific examples of his past statements, showing how they contradicted his current stance on Trump. Worse yet, Her article was well written and persuasive, making it hard for him to brush off entirely. Sitting in his high-rise apartment overlooking the city, Richard called Lisa, his producer. "Have you seen this?" he asked, his voice tense. Lisa sounded groggy, clearly still half asleep. "Seen what?" "This article by some journalist named Karoline Leavitt. She's tearing me apart online." Lisa sighed. "Yeah, I saw it earlier. It's been getting a lot of attention." "Well, what are we going to do about it?" Richard snapped. "We can't just let her get away with this." "Relax," Lisa said calmly. "It's not the end of the world. These things blow over eventually. Just ignore it." But Richard couldn't ignore it. Every time he refreshed his social media feed, there were more comments tagging him, urging him to respond to Karoline's challenge. Some of his fans were starting to question whether he had anything to say in his defense. Others mocked him, saying he must be scared to face her. The pressure mounted throughout the day until Richard finally decided he had no choice but to address the situation. That evening, during his next live show, Richard brought up Karoline's article. He started by mocking her name, pronouncing it exaggeratedly to elicit laughs from the audience. "So apparently there's this young journalist, Karoline Leavitt, who thinks she's found some big scandal about me." He smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Let me tell you something. When you've been in this business as long as I have, you learn to expect these kinds of attacks." The crowd chuckled along with him, but Richard could feel their energy shift slightly. They weren't laughing, as loudly as they usually did. He pressed on, attempting to dismantle Karoline's arguments point by point. However, the more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was struggling. His usual wit felt forced, and his attempts to discredit her came across as defensive rather than convincing. Back at her apartment, Karoline watched the segment with a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. On one hand, she was glad that Richard had acknowledged her article. It meant her message was reaching a wider audience. On the other hand, his dismissive tone only fueled her determination to prove him wrong. She knew she couldn't let him get away with brushing her off so easily. The next day, Karoline took her campaign a step further. She reached out to several talk shows and podcasts, offering to appear as a guest to discuss the issues raised in her article. To her surprise, many of them agreed. Over the course of a week, she appeared on multiple programs, each time delivering a clear and concise argument against Richard's methods. She emphasized the importance of respectful discourse and accused Richard of using ridicule to avoid engaging in meaningful conversations. Her appearances gained even more traction, drawing attention from both sides of the political spectrum. Liberals praised her for standing up to a figure they often criticized, while conservatives appreciated her defense of Trump and her broader critique of biased commentary. Even people who didn't align with either side admired her poise and intelligence. As Karoline's star continued to rise, Richard grew increasingly agitated. He tried to counter her momentum by addressing her on his show again, but his efforts fell flat. Without realizing it, he was playing right into her hands. Each time he attacked her, she responded with calm, measured rebuttals that only strengthened her position. One afternoon, Lisa approached Richard with a proposal. "What if you actually debated her?" she suggested. "I mean, think about it. It could be great for ratings, and it would give you a chance to shut her down once and for all." Richard hesitated. The idea of debating Karoline made him uneasy. He prided himself on being quick-witted and knowledgeable, but something about her unnerved him. She was younger, yes, but she was also incredibly prepared. He had read her articles and watched her interviews, and he couldn't deny that she was good, maybe even better than he wanted to admit. Still, he couldn't refuse without looking weak. Reluctantly, he agreed to the debate, setting a date for 2 weeks later. The announcement sent shockwaves through the media world. Everyone wanted to know how this showdown would play out. Would Richard crush his opponent with his trademark humor? Or would Karoline manage to hold her own against a veteran commentator? In the days leading up to the debate, both Richard and Karoline threw themselves into preparation. Richard spent hours reviewing old clips of Karoline's interviews, trying to find weaknesses in her arguments. He rehearsed potential zingers and practiced deflecting tough questions. Despite his outward confidence, though, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this might not go as smoothly as he hoped. Karoline, on the other hand, approached the debate with quiet determination. She gathered research, studied Richard's past performances, and fine-tuned her responses. Unlike Richard, she wasn't focused on winning in the traditional sense. For her, the goal was to spark a conversation, to show people that disagreement didn't have to devolve into hostility. As the day of the debate drew closer, anticipation reached a fever pitch. News outlets covered every detail, speculating on who would come out on top. Supporters of both sides flooded social media with predictions and memes. It seemed like the entire country was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when Richard Wolff and Karoline Leavitt finally faced off. For Richard, the pressure was almost unbearable. He had always thrived under scrutiny, but this time felt different. Karoline wasn't just another critic. She was a formidable opponent who refused to back down. And as much as he hated to admit it, part of him wondered if he had underestimated her from the start. Karoline, meanwhile, remained calm. She knew the stakes were high, but she also believed in the power of honest dialogue. Whatever happened during the debate, she was determined to stay true to her principles. After all, this wasn't just about proving Richard wrong. It was about showing the world that respect and understanding could coexist, even in the midst of disagreement. Neither of them realized it yet, but the upcoming debate would change both, their lives in ways they couldn't have imagined. What started as a clash of ideologies was about to become something far greater, a testament to the enduring value of courage, integrity, and the willingness to listen.